Well, good morning, friends, or good afternoon, or good evening, as the case may be, wherever you are on broadcast today. This is Casey Gwinn, the president of the National Family Justice Center. On behalf of our CEO, Gael Strack, and our Director of Technical Assistance, Natalia Aguirre, and our whole team at the Family Justice Center Alliance, we're happy to have you joining us for this, whether you're listening live today or you will be listening later to the recorded broadcast. We're honored to have you with us today. You will note on the screen, if you're listening live today, some information about it, about the audio, about how to access the presentation, and I would refer you to that information. We do mute attendees now throughout our presentation. This is primarily because we have so many attendees. We're nearly 400 on this call today. We are broadcasting live from downtown San Diego, where we have had an incident out on the street, so we have a lot of sirens right now in downtown. I apologize for that. There will be some noise from sirens for a little while this morning. But we will be recording this, and it will be available on our website. You will note in the instructions that it says to send questions, and please, if you're on the GoToWebinar platform, we encourage you to type questions. Natalia will be monitoring those, and we will be doing the question and answer period at the end of our presentation from our panelists. So we appreciate your patience with us with a little bit of noise, as some emergency personnel are dealing with issues outside. But it's great to have you all here with us today. As I mentioned, my name is Casey Gwinn. I serve as the president of the Alliance. The Alliance both operates and hosts technical assistance and support for developing and operating family justice centers around the United States. We also run the Training Institute for Strangulation Prevention, which was first sponsored by OVW and is now a fee-based program where we provide services and training for police officers, prosecutors, advocates, medical professionals, mental health professionals, and others all across the country and around the world on near-fatal and non-fatal strangulation cases in both domestic violence and sexual assault. We train professionals in how to investigate the cases, how to document them. We also run a Funding and Sustainability Institute and a Leadership Training Institute and community agencies, particularly around mergers, efforts to develop multi-agency partnerships and other ways that you can increase effectiveness and efficiency in the work you're doing with victims of sexual assault and domestic violence. We've also created a number of pilot projects through the Alliance. Those pilot projects include, most recently, the Center for Prosecutors, which is an innovative approach to bring in brand new graduated lawyers from a local law school, and we've developed a law firm operating right out of the Alliance called the Center for Solo Practitioners, working with Thomas Jefferson School of Law, so that we can get more legal services to victims of domestic violence and their kids. In our case, that's all through the San Diego Family Justice Center, but we love that center model. We've also developed Camp Hope California, which began as a pilot project in San Diego, and we're now replicating across the state of California, and soon we hope around the country to provide camping and mentoring opportunities to children exposed to domestic violence. We just finished a summer program with 375 kids and an evaluation that's quite stunning conducted by the University of Oklahoma. So we have a lot of other programs. You can go to our website at familyjusticecenter.com to see the programs. But we do always give a shout out to what we call our small but mighty team. And Gael Strack always references the power of we and the way we work with other organizations both around the country and around the world to do our work, even though our team is small. We also want to thank our sponsors for today's webinar. Today the webinar is sponsored by the Office on Violence Against Women in the U.S. Department of Justice, and we want to thank Hansen and Nadine Neufeld and Susan Williams and the whole team at OVW for their support in the work that we do in supporting family justice centers and other community-based agencies working in elder abuse, human trafficking. So we appreciate their support for today's webinar. Every month broadcast, we do give a shout out to our conference. We host an international conference every year. For the next 3 years, actually, that conference will be in San Diego. Next April, we'll be at the San Diego Bayfront Hilton Hotel, which is a beautiful hotel right on the water in San Diego. We'd love to have you join us. Our conference is fairly well known for the multidisciplinary nature of the conference, so lots of communities send teams to our conference, often sending prosecutors, police officers, advocates, mental health professionals, medical professionals, all coming together both to focus on coordinated community response strategies, to focus on how to do multi-agents that may have a family justice center, they may not, but one of the great focus areas of our conference is really how you produce better outcomes by providing bundled services and collaborative service delivery when you're working with victims and their kids. So that information is on our website at familyjusticecenter.com. We'd love to have you join us next April in San Diego, and as you're looking forward, we're going to have a couple of great years after that. In 2015 and 2016, we'll actually be at Paradise Point Resort, which is a beautiful resort in San Diego, and our focus will be each year, next year, 2015 and 2016, we'll have components on care and work that we all do as part of our conference. So please check that out, and please look toward joining us next April in San Diego. Just as I said, one more reminder, as I mentioned at the beginning, we will be recording this webinar, and it will be available in our online resource library. Our resource library used to be password protected. It is not any longer. We've opened it to all 11,000 members of the Alliance and to others to access our information. So the resource will download a webinar like this along with hundreds of others that we have posted on our website for your benefit. We often find that people listen in groups to these webinars, and we look forward to you listening today and perhaps even later hosting a time when you could download this and use it in a group so that more people can listen to this webinar and then go forward. I do want to mention the domestic violence dynamics focus of this webinar. We are particularly focused on the dynamics of domestic violence as we dive into the webinar today. We've called this Domestic Violence 101, but we're actually particularly interested in the dialogue that's going to happen with a team of survivors here, not just about the basics of domestic violence, but about the basics of survivors, not just looking at something on a piece of paper or listening to somebody do a presentation, but actually really focusing on what this feels like in a relationship, how it plays out in a relationship, and how the dynamics of domestic violence play out as a survivor is trying to go to a courthouse to get assistance, to get help, to go to a family justice center, navigating the family court system, the criminal court system, perhaps navigating mental health, child welfare system. So we're really interested in how those domestic violence dynamics play out in all of those settings as we dive into this webinar. The webinar has been approved for continuing education credits, what we call CEUs. Those are available for many of you that need CEUs. That information is all going to be posted on our website. We do provide the CEUs at no charge, but the certification does have a small fee, and you can pay for that certificate on our website so that you have access to that after the webinar. I do want to mention our team. So we actually took a picture this morning with Gael Strack and our survivors and Natalia Geary joining us. So we have an amazing group of women joining us. We do have another member of our Voices Committee who's actually our chair right now, Kevin Farr, who was hoping to join us today, a survivor of domestic violence in an intimate relationship, and was going to join today. And he may be calling in, we're not sure, but we did want to remember Kevin in our thoughts and prayers. We're very honored to have Yvonne and Jenica and Nicole and Lisbeth with us. You'll also see the name Pam there. Pam O'Leary is our Director of Client Services at the San Diego Family Justice Center. She works for the Alliance but oversees all of the case management and client services at the San Diego Family Justice Center. Pam is an LCSW and is going to be here with us in this as questions come up or if there are other things that we need to be sensitive to related to services for victims and their kids. So we're happy to have Pam in the room with us along with Gail and Natalia today as we dive in with our panel. So that picture was taken about 20 minutes ago, so that's the real group. We're actually sitting in my office at the National Family Justice Center Alliance, sitting around having coffee and talking about these issues as we dive in. I do want to mention just a couple of things, and I might even ask a couple of the members here to chime in on this, but the members that are sitting here today, our panelists, are all members of our Voices Committee in San Diego. The Voices Committee is a group of survivors that come together really in many ways after the crisis in order to support each other, though primarily to become advocates for the Family Justice Center and other allied agencies to be able to share their story once it's safe for them to be able to share their story and really help educate others about the dynamics of domestic violence and the journey that they have gone on. And we're particularly excited to have a group of women that know each other because that interact with each other. Not all survivors choose to stay involved in the work after they've gotten through an abusive relationship or an abusive situation, but some do and find that helping others is really a call on their lives and a passion of theirs. So I'm going to ask them as we get a little further into this to talk a little bit more about Voices. I do want to also thank Yvonne and the whole team here for the work that they've done over the last few years of putting together their own website. We have Voices committees, many family justice centers now across the United States, modeled after what these amazing women have done in San Diego. But that website is a great example of how you can build partnerships together with other survivors, be able to get out information. It's sponsored by the Verizon Foundation, and we honor them for supporting that work. We've had help from both the Avon Foundation for Women and the Verizon Foundation in this journey of developing our Voices model over the years, and we're particularly appreciative to both of them. So we're going to dive into this topic now. Today, you'll see on the power and control wheel up here. The power and control wheel is something that is no stranger to most of you on this call if you work in the field of domestic violence, though we thought that it might be beneficial to share a little bit about the history of the power and control wheel. Most of you know that Ellen Pence was part of the creative team that on the power and control wheel quite a number of years ago now. Our platform is very difficult for us to broadcast videos. We're going to be improving that, we hope, in the very near future. But I do have a video clip in here as a start from Ellen Pence. Many of you know Ellen died just now a couple of years ago from metastasized cancer, and really is a matriarch of the battered women's movement in America and was a dear personal friend of both Gail and myself. And Ellen has talked and written a lot over the years about the power and control wheel. So we're going to do our best to play this. On your end, it will be a little bit choppy. Those of you who are on the webinar platform will find the video doesn't work well. But most of it here from this short clip from Ellen Pence. And we thought it best to just have Ellen tell you about the history and the genesis of the power and control wheel as we get started today.
When we decided what are we going to teach, we went to the women's groups and said, okay, if we can get these guys for 8 weeks or 10 weeks or 15 or however long we get them, what do you want us to teach them? And out of that eventually came the power and control wheel, those sessions with the women. This was the one that I remember that really got to me. This woman said, if you live with a batterer, it is not cyclical. It isn't something that comes and goes. You live with a batterer every day. Even when he's being nice to you, it's a part of the violence. Because if he's raping you and telling you you're no good and you're ugly here, and then 3 days later he's telling you you're beautiful and I need you and I want you, it's all part of the same thing. And don't think it's cyclical. And I went, well, yeah, I never thought that. And, you know, I think I must have said it was cyclical, right? So then I kept saying, well, okay, what else is it like to live with a batterer? And then I remember coming back from that meeting and saying to Cora and Michael, we just got to go to these women's groups and ask these questions. And so we started going, what's it like to live with them? Describe it, and people starting to tell stories. And then we got into the word tactics. Somehow in the process, the word tactics came out. And we started asking him, what other tactics does he use against you besides violence? And he never lets us have any friends, so then we'd get all the women to tell a story about that. Who doesn't he let you see, when? And then the word isolation started coming up. We lumped all that under isolation. And he's always putting you down and calling you names, and what are all the things he's doing that way? And they talk about that, and then emotional abuse became that category. And so it came from these stories. We actually had more tactics than what are on that power and control wheel, but they didn't display well graphically. You know, you just had to all right, let's get down to the big 9 or whatever, because you could do a lot more tactics. There's some I wish now we had done from the beginning because they're so fundamental, but the ones that are on there I think are core tactics that almost all abusers use, you know. So anyways, these stories then, if every woman in the room had a story that fit this thing, then we knew it was a core tactic. And we went to about 3, we always had our groups in neighborhoods. So in central Duluth, we had a group going in west and east side. So we went to all 3 of those groups over several months and kept developing this thing over and over. And we'd bring our little designs in, and we had a lot of different designs to it. And finally, we came up with the one where we put the violence around the outside and all the other tactics on the inside. We were trying to make it like a wheel where the violence held everything together, and these tactics were all part of a system. And we didn't say that the reason for the women weren't telling us men did it in order to get power and control. What they said was they ended up with all the power and all the control when they did this. And I always interpreted it as that women were saying men desired power and control. When I did my men's groups, I'd always say that. I'd always think that you were desiring, but I never heard the men say that. And that's when I started to understand the difference between feeling entitled to it, entitled to that control, and desiring it. Like as a white person, me feeling entitled to certain space wasn't a desire to dominate people of color. It's 2 different things, you know, to want to dominate someone and to feel entitled to be in control. So I ended up not thinking that men wanted power and control. I ended up thinking and realizing, I think, that they felt entitled to it, which is a different way of talking to men about it then. It's the heck out of me when people will look at the power and control and say, well, a lot of people do that. Right, but a lot of people don't attach to it the sexual abuse and the ability to beat someone up and the ability to scare someone and intimidate someone. So I can, you know, call you a name or something like that, but you can't say the abuse is the same unless you know, it's almost like those other forms of abuse on that wheel are glued onto the violence, where they're kind of attached like this, and the violence shapes everything, and the ability to control someone's thoughts and their physical and sexual safety. That's what I think people don't understand when they try to equate women calling men names and telling them they're no good. I mean, yes, that's emotionally abusive for a woman to put a man down and stuff like that. But he isn't living in this kind of fear that battering is all about. It's making someone afraid of their physical and sexual safety, and eventually being able to use that fear in a way that gives you pretty much total control over them, their thoughts, their sense of themselves. And to equate that to other relationships where people put each other down or call each other names and not understand what it means to introduce all the violence parts to it is, that's what's so difficult in this day and age, that people still do not understand that.
And it's a powerful, I think, reminder. The Domestic Violence Abuse Prevention Project in Duluth has done a whole series of briefings to explain the background of the power and control wheel, to document the way it's been used. We have noted those on the screen for you, and the way it gets discussed in lots of different settings. I do just want to highlight one thing before we dive in with our panelists here, and that is the last statement on that, which is, it is an excellent tool for law enforcement officers interviewing victims. I remain convinced that the vast majority of law enforcement officers do not ask the right questions when it comes to interviewing survivors of domestic violence and related sexual assault. And the typical what happened next, what happened next, what happened next kind of questioning that can happen in law enforcement, both by police and prosecutor, does not help put a framework around the experience of survivors when they're trying to tell their story. And the power and control can do that. We actually use a version of the power and control wheel in interviews that takes off most of the examples and just uses headings, using economic abuse, using coercion and threats, using intimidation, that can jog an interviewer to say, you know, this is a very helpful layout of how abusive relationships sometimes work. Has he ever used intimidation with you? Has he ever used coercion? Then go through the categories in interviewing a victim. You will find that suddenly it's not about this one incident, or it's not about the push or the shove or the slap or even the grab to the neck. It's now much more complex. And yes, it takes time, but the contextual background that it provides for the violent incident, as Ellen was referring to it as, changes the whole dynamic. So you can look at it both ways. One, you need to understand the violence, and two, once you see the violence, you need the context in order to really see the big picture. So as we dive into this, we just wanted to make those points. These are the categories in the power and control wheel that are before you in the presentation materials. Our team of panelists sitting here today have the control wheel in front of them. Those are the headings in each of them. And we're just going to dive in to the first topic in the power and control wheel, which is intimidation. And I'm going to ask each of our survivors that are with us today, if as we identify things and you look at each of these categories, if you just tell us your name and then share an example of it. The purpose of this 1-hour webinar is not really for each survivor to tell their entire story, but we're going to try to keep this moving relatively quickly and be able to let you tell us a little bit about the experiences that you've had. So let's just dive into the intimidation category. In your relationship situation where you were in an abusive situation with your partner, did any of them use intimidation? And if so, can you give us an example of how your partner intimidated you or used intimidation? Anybody's free to jump in wherever you'd like. Anybody want to go first?
Oh, okay. My name's Jen. I had quite a bit of intimidation, I think, in my relationship. You know, my boyfriend at the time was much bigger than me, over 6 foot, over 200 pounds, and he used to love to destroy my things and steal from me. I would come home and we wouldn't even really be fighting, but I think he would know that I would be upset, and the mirrors would be broken, everything would be torn apart. This might be due to the drugs, the fact that he was crazy. Both of those things probably played into that. And he used to steal things from me, my money, my purse. We didn't have any like pets, like it says on there, to anything like that. He didn't have any weapons, luckily, just his fist. But he definitely liked to destroy anything that he could.
And how did that intimidate Jen?
Well, if he could destroy something like that, he could do worse to me. I mean, that's exactly what you think when you like walk into your house and you think it is completely destroyed. You're like, okay, he broke the mirror, he broke the fridge, he broke this, you know, the bed. What else can he do?
You knew his capacity.
Yeah, you know capable of. You know, if you get a little angry and you feel like you need to break everything, what's going to happen when you get really angry?
Okay. Anybody else?
This is Yvonne. In my case, he used a couple different intimidation tactics. One was abusing my cat, where he would smack her for really no good reason. The other was much more severe as far as displaying weapons. He would often pull out a gun when he was upset, either making threats. In the circle of violence, once we had made up, he would usually ask for the gun as far as in the process of making up, so that I didn't have to worry about it. And the next fight would come up, and he would have another gun that he had maybe had stockpiled at his house.
Wow. So was the gun used with you in an intimidating way? Was it just holding it? Was it pointing at you? How did he use the gun, or was it talking about the gun?
Some ways he would threaten to hurt himself, threaten to shoot my cat. At one point I mentioned that I was going to call the police, and he told me to call the police. He pulled the gun out and then threatened that he could probably shoot 2 of them before they entered the apartment.
So you knew he had the capacity,
yes,
to use the gun whenever he wanted. Anybody else on the intimidation piece?
Yes, this is Nicole. It was interesting on the slide where it says making them feel afraid and using looks, because I just knew that there was just this one particular look, and it was during the attention phase that I knew that I had to modify my behavior. So it was always with the constant looks and gestures, destroying my property all the time. I had a car that he purchased, and he would dent it a lot or break the windows, and any way that he could just take something that I worked hard for and destroy it so that I could be more dependent on him. Also with the weapons, he was a gang member at the time, and he did have weapons, and he would bring it out a lot as intimidation, but he would fire it as well, intending to miss me. So that was a really big one in me staying, because if he could just fire it off like that and miss me, and would stop me from hitting the target. So, yeah.
Elizabeth?
Well, this is Lisbeth. He used all of the above, but the one I remember the most is he got a small rabbit for my son, and he actually killed the rabbit with his own hands, and just because he said I didn't take care of it. So that was really traumatizing, because he did it in front of my little niece and my little sister. Just killed the rabbit with his own hands, and just to show how strong he was and what he was capable of doing. And he also had weapons. All the time he used to bring weapons to the house just to show them to me, that he was able, what kind of weapons he was able to get on the streets to make me scared of him.
As you all are kind of reflecting on this topic of intimidation, after you came forward to try to get help, whether it was first calling 911 or it was first getting a restraining order or it was reaching out to a community-based domestic violence agency or talking to your family or something that you were doing to try to engage help with somebody that you were willing to talk to, did the intimidation increase? Did it decrease? Did it change? What was his reaction, for those of you that did end up in the system, kind of what was his reaction at that point, and how did his tactics change with intimidation, if they did?
I think it made it worse. I think when someone feels like they can keep getting away with something, they're going to keep doing it. But as soon as they are threatened by like police or by their life changing or being put away, I think, well, for my situation, it just made it worse. It just made it to where I felt like he was going to go crazy. He would tell me he's going to come over with a baseball bat once I left. He would leave me messages saying that he would find me. He would say that, you know, he was never going to get put away, so he would run, and I would never be able to run from him. I think it made the situation for me way worse until he was locked up. I just didn't see it at all.
Thanks, Jen.
Miss Yvonne, in my case, when I attempted to get a restraining order, he told me that he would be forced to ruin my credibility and turn the whole situation around on me. He also had a brother and sister-in-law that were former San Diego police officers and detectives, and he was convincing me that he would be able to take the upper hand because of who he knew.
Anybody else on that one? Reaching out for help and whether his tactics changed after you reached out for help?
I noticed that his tactics changed when it got into the stalking. There was a lot of stalking him back when it happened to me. There was MySpace, so there were a lot of MySpace messages. All of a sudden, he started accusing me of being with his friends, which I never had contact with. It was just, there were these stories just popping up, and I'm going to use this against you, and leaving notes on my car, or just, I'm watching you kind of intimidation. And then it got into the economical abuse with that too, because he started to, he tried to buy a car with my identity, or there was a lot of identity theft going on with that. So it was just different tactics that were popping up, very indirect.
And I think that's an important piece for us to highlight, maybe even first, this intimidation piece, because in 20 years as a prosecutor and almost 30 years of interacting with men who are violent, and in some cases with women who are violent, I've never seen a situation where an abuser doesn't intimidate. I've never seen a relationship where an abuser doesn't intimidate. I mean, it might be, hey, baby, I really love you. I promise I'm never going to do this again. Man, if you don't call the police, I promise it'll be better. But you're going to destroy us if you talk to the police or if you go to court and testify. And then on the other side of that same dynamic, 2 weeks later is, you know, if you testify in court, I'll take the kids and you'll never see them again. You'll never, I mean, it's all of it. blended together. And I think early on in my career as a prosecutor, I didn't get that. I mean, as far as I was concerned, once you got involved with me, you were safe. I mean, after all, I'm from the government. I'm a prosecutor. I'm here to help. And I didn't get that you were actually in more danger and that I wasn't making you feel safer just because I was now prosecuting him. In fact, I was probably putting you in more danger and creating more danger and probably creating. I will just share one quick piece in Yvonne's case. I didn't get that early on, and I got involved in the case, and I was reading through one of the police reports on a restraining order violation that Yvonne had reported, and he was sitting in his car outside her work, and when the police officers came up to the car, they said, you know, you can't be here, she's scared of you, and she's concerned that you have firearms. And he looked at the police officer with a total dead-faced, matter-of-fact look on his face and said, I'm not going to hurt her sitting here. If I was going to kill her, I'd use a high-powered rifle from 100 yards, and I'd hit her with a scope, and she'd never even know what happened until she was dead. And he just looked right at the police officer, and I remember reading that, and it gave me chills, and I can only imagine what that felt like to you, because I wasn't living your experience. I was reading it on a piece of paper, and I remember reading it thinking, wow, I've totally missed how dangerous he is and how intimidating he is in that process. So I don't know, any other quick comments about intimidation or that dynamic? I think that's a good place to start.
In my case, the first time I put a restraining order, he actually ran away to Mexico. He ran away and he came back like 2-3 months after, telling me he had changed, that he loved me, he wanted to be with me and the kids, and that he was going to do a lot better. That was the first time.
Did that draw you? Did that kind of intimidation and outreach to you draw you back to him?
A little bit, I could say, but I still knew that he was not going to change, that he was going to start again doing the same thing. He was going to start using drugs again. When you're in an abusive relationship, you always have that hope that he's going to change. So I think that that's the other 50%, just because my children. That was the only reason. But I didn't went back.
No, I appreciate, Lisbeth, you sharing that. Let's shift gears to the next topic, talking about emotional abuse and using emotional abuse, both verbal and nonverbal communication and other things and other strategies in order to leave you in a place that causes you to feel less about yourself, to be ashamed, to be kind of more susceptible to. So as you reflect on that topic and some of the categories, can you give some examples of how your partner used emotional abuse with you in the relationship?
These are put downs, but then followed by maybe a couple days later how wonderful I was. A lot of the put downs and the abuse happened in front of his 13-year-old daughter, which magnified the put downs because somebody else heard it. In a specific incident, my father was going through Alzheimer's at the time, and he told me that nobody else would want me because of just different examples of why I was not worthy or worth it.
This is Jen. I think for me, the emotional abuse was probably the hardest part of the entire relationship. Bruises go away. Those things will quickly fade, and they're not really what I remember from the painful parts. The emotional abuse is what stays with you. That's what you keep. That's what you'll take to the next relationship. That's what really hurts you in the longer run. Similar to Yvonne's, the put-downs, the blaming, you always feel like it's your fault. He managed to take somebody in person, and at the end of the relationship, I couldn't even recognize who I was. And it's really an awful thing, telling a woman worth that she's nothing and having her actually believe it. Because the way they make you feel at the very end, you're convinced. You're convinced that you're nothing. You're convinced that you're ugly. You're convinced that you're never going to meet anybody. I look back now, and I'm just like, how did that happen? Because I'm a very confident person, and I have a master's degree, and I've accomplished a lot in my life, and I actually let him make me think that I was nothing. But for months and months, it took me a long time to get through that abuse, more than anything.
Thanks, Jen.
I think that Jen made a really good point. Bruises fade, but the emotional abuse is going to stay with you. It's like you can't find the scar to put the Neosporin on to fix that. I just remember that the name calling was really, it was continuous. It was always name calling. I mean, some of the worst names to childish names like Pizza Face, because I had acne at the time, or it was just a lot of mind games and really minimizing you. It's like chipping away at you, just let you believe it, that you're nothing and that you can't get out of it and that you don't deserve anything better. Or it's really gradual, like chipping away with those name calling.
Thanks, Nicole.
In my case, there was actually most of my relationship was emotional abuse than physical abuse. Like Jen said, I was a really confident person. I had a lot of friends. I had a lot of family, and I was a happy person. But then when I started living with him, he started making me feel I was nothing, that people were just fake to me just to look good. But the reality was that they didn't actually like me because I was nothing. He was a good-looking guy, so he always made me feel less than him. He made me feel I was ugly for him, that he was capable of doing a lot better, and he was just with me because he felt sorry for me. And just all these things that just make you feel you're nothing, and they're actually doing something for you. They're doing a favor to you by being with you. And
some of you know that I grew up in a home with a father who had grown up in a very violent and abusive home, and took a lot of those turns into our family. And one of them was this emotional abuse piece. And as you've all been sharing, one of the things that kind of struck me growing up with my dad, who has since passed away, was I kind of was always off guard. I was always off balance. You know, my dad would look at me and say something, and I wasn't sure if he was joking or if I wasn't sure if he was mad or if he was pretending like he was mad, or he'd say something and then I'd react, and then he'd come down on me for reacting because somehow I'd said something inappropriate when objectively what he said was wrong. But I'm the son, I'm the child. I don't get to say, you know, Dad, that was wrong what you said. I mean, I laugh. I had a counselor a number of years ago say, well, you need to learn to express yourself to your father. And I just laughed out loud. And I said I never would have told my dad how I really felt because I would have been hit. I mean, I would have suffered severe consequences if I'd said, you know, Dad, playing mind games with me right now. I mean, I'd just laugh at the thought that I would ever say that to my father. No, you know, is this a good day? Is this a bad day? Is this going to go or not go well? Did that happen?
every day.
It's like Jekyll and Hyde.
Yeah, I mean, I felt like I developed this other, like this sense where it was like I could just feel when his mood was changing. It was like, and there was tension. There was going to be an explosion pretty soon. So it was on and off, but I could always feel it building up.
That's how they turn you into what they want you to be. They just manipulate you, and just because you're so fearful that they're gonna react, you just agree in everything they say, and then you and when you least notice, like you turn it into what they want you to be. So if they want you to like coffee, you're gonna like coffee even if them, and you don't want to make them mad. Just that's how it works with them.
Well, thanks, Elizabeth. Let's move in. We have a poster in the power and control wheel. We're going to try to get quickly through each of them a little bit if we can. The next topic is isolation, and we'd like to just spend a few minutes looking at that. The control piece over what you do, what you say, what you read, where you go, friends, limiting outside involvement. The jealousy piece is of particular interest to us. I see just unbelievable jealousy sometimes from abusive partners. So I'd love to have any of you give an example of this isolation issue that came up in your relationship.
In my case, like I said before, I used to have a lot of friends and I have a lot of family, and my relationship was 7 years. So by the end of the 7 years, I didn't even have contact with my parents or my sisters. That's how bad it gets through the years.
Let me ask you, Elizabeth, what was he doing to make that happen? Was he telling you they were bad, or that you had to stay away from them, or what was the dynamic that made that happen?
He used to tell me they were bad people, that they were not a good influence for me or my kids, that I needed to take care of him and my kids, that I didn't need to go out with my friends. And then he started jealousy also. He was a really jealous person. he would even get jealous of my own cousins. So, like I said, that's when I noticed when even his own family, because we were living with my mom, and I was like, this cannot happen. Like, my parents are my parents. They don't want anything bad for me. Like, that's when I said he's wrong, and that's when I decided to end the relationship. But that's like, I was talking to all my friends, to my own family, and just practically didn't answer the phone. That's
Because he
how-
said you're not to answer the phone.
no.
Wow. Other examples of isolation?
This is Yvonne. He would find out about previous relationships that I had been in and then realize I was still friends with not people and try to avoid that. As well, not like my sister and not want to bound her and try to sever that relationship as well.
Anybody else?
I remember with friends, it was like I couldn't have girlfriends because if I did, then I was automatically in a romantic relationship with them. So I wasn't even allowed to have friends. And with family, he really didn't. It was my mom is this, my mom's that. It was always us against the world. It was just us two, and everyone else just didn't understand. They just didn't get it.
Now, when you're in the middle of that, and he plays that, it's us against the world, you and me, baby, against everybody else. In part of that, I mean, when you're really in it, and you're madly in love, and you care about it, and it's us against everybody, does that suck you in a little bit at times?
Yeah, it sounds romantic.
Yeah.
It sounds like you two will be together forever and you found that person. It sounds like he's going to sweep you off your feet instead of knock you off your feet.
Especially when your friends or your relatives start noticing that something is wrong, and they tell you something is wrong, like this is not normal. Then, and you make the big mistake of telling him, then he says, see, they don't want us to be together. They're not good for us. They're just jealous of us, so don't talk to them. And you actually believe it. Oh, yeah, maybe it's true. They don't want to see us together. That's why they're telling me all this stuff. You just stop talking to that people because they change everything to their own way.
Well, those are good examples and definitely good things to be aware of for the professionals working in the field and interacting with survivors. The next category in the wheel is minimizing, denying, and blaming, and it's a whole set of issues around how you get the reality of what it really is, so that you end up, in many ways, you end up blaming yourself for something that somebody else is doing to you, based on the choices that they're making. As you kind of reflect, any of you, back on your abusive situation, was this tactic used, and how was it used, if you have an example?
I think it was definitely used. You kind of like hit it spot on, like they're doing something, but at the end of our relationship, I mean, I actually thought it was like partially my fault. I used to sit there and think, like, if I hadn't done this, then this wouldn't have happened. And he used to be so good at telling me every time we would argue, despite the fact that I may be the one covered in bruises, he would love to tell me, I need to take responsibility for this too.
That you should
Yes,
take responsibility.
every time. I could just picture it. I can remember he just quoted it every time. And at the end it worked, because I thought that I had actually done things wrong. And, you know, I did hit him back. I probably... not a violent person, never hit anybody, but I thought if I'm going down fighting. So there was one, maybe even two times where I had tried hitting him back. Obviously, I'm not nearly as strong as he was, it did nothing. But I used to think that I shouldn't have done that, because then it just made me, like am I abusive too? Because I tried to, like, defend myself.
Somehow defending yourself was wrong.
Yeah, like I started to feel like I defended myself, so that must be wrong. And you just start to take blame. It actually wasn't until I, like, came here and learned that, you know, from Dr. Last, that I didn't do anything wrong.
That's good, Jen. Anybody else?
This is Yvonne. He would often blame me for hurting his feelings, something that I would say, and not intentionally to hurt his feelings, but he would take great offense to small things and come out of proportion to where we'd have almost half an hour to an hour discussion about the incident and how it was all my fault.
Anybody else?
My abuser was addicted to crystal meth, and every time he was using drugs, he would blame me. It was your fault because you did this, or it's because you don't love me, or because you don't listen to me. So I feel so depressed and sad that needed it and I use it. And if I get aggressive, it's because of you. It's your fault.
And did you buy that on some level in certain situations? Did you think, yeah, I shouldn't have done that. Now I caused him to go use?
Yes. Most of the time it worked and made me feel bad and guilty. And I just, like the cycle, I started doing whatever he wanted me to do, so he didn't do that anymore because it was my fault.
That's a good example, Elizabeth.
Yeah,
Nicole?
everything is your fault. I mean, I remember he lost his job because he didn't get there on time, and then that was my fault. And I was at school at the time. It's just every single thing that goes to fault. And I remember it was like one time he said, "Oh, did you notice that you haven't been acting weird today or nagging?" And I was like, "Oh, yeah, I did." And I remember feeling so proud of myself that I didn't cause anything bad that day. And, I mean,
Wow.
everything's your fault.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know if any of you went through the control wheel, but this minimizing piece, for those of us that work in the criminal justice system, this is a huge piece for us, both the minimizing and the denying. Your typical parole officer, your typical prosecutor, even judges, it amazes us sometimes, and I've been doing this work for a long time. I still kind of shake my head. I'd be in a situation where a woman had called 911 and she was hysterical and she'd been severely abused, and 24 hours later or 36 hours later, when a victim witness person would reach out to her or a domestic violence detective, she would say, "Nothing happened. I don't even know what you're talking about. The police officer's lying about that. No, that didn't happen. No, yes, I said that, but I totally made it up." I mean, the minimization, or yes, we had an argument, but it was my fault and nothing really happened. No, it wasn't that big a deal. That whole minimizing and denying piece, especially when the criminal justice system tries to engage, for those that haven't been in an abusive situation, that's quite foreign to the professional hearing that thing. How can you go from you were there when it happened, you just lived it, and now 24 or 48 hours later you're saying, no, it wasn't that big a deal, it was my fault, nothing really happened. I don't know if you can react to that at all, but that is a tough one for people to understand.
Yeah, sometimes it doesn't take 24 hours. I mean, I've forgiven him in like 30 minutes. So 30 minutes later, I would have been like, that never happened. So it's just you forgive them, you just want to move on, pretend it never happened, and everything will go back to normal. That's your mentality at the time. Yeah, everything that happened, happened.
Mm-hmm.
This is Yvonne. I minimized to a friend of mine who was adamant that she take pictures of my bruises, and I said, no, it's okay, everything's fine, and she insisted, luckily, to take the pictures anyways, and I finally allowed her to, just to kind of move on from that topic.
Mm-hmm. I will say to all of you, there's a lot of research that's been done in the last few years now about trauma and reacting to trauma, and a lot of work going on around what trauma-informed services look like. And a lot of the trauma work is now finding that victims of trauma in general minimize. And victims of trauma often, if they have to do something, you go through a hurricane or you go through a natural disaster of some kind, you can't really spend a lot of time focusing on how terrible it is because you'd be paralyzed. You got to do stuff. You got to save yourself, you got to save your kids, you got to navigate, you got to manage. Life has to go on. I got to get this behind me and deal with whatever's in front of me. So it's a very natural response to trauma. But it is interesting how in the domestic violence world we obsess, so why is she minimizing, why is she denying, when in fact what's happening is you're trying to navigate and you're trying to manage and you're trying to cope. And minimization and denial are coping skills. We saw it at 9/11 in a lot of research about how law enforcement officers minimized their partner just dying because they had to go save other people. They couldn't really focus on this incredible trauma that had just happened. They had other stuff to do, so for all of us to be aware of. And then maybe Lisbeth in particular, I want just to ask you about this children piece. You made mention to the fact that you often kind of were evaluating and making decisions based on the kids, because he would play the kids, and the kids were an issue for you in all of this, and the impact on the kids and what the kids needed and a father and so forth. Can you talk a little bit about, did he use the children in this power and control tactics? Did the children become a bit of a weapon for him at times? Control will relate when it came to kids.
Yes, it became first emotional. He would use the kids, or you want the kids to grow up without a dad or without a mom. Because he actually, I remember one time, he used to go to Mexico often with his family, and I was not able to because I was not legally here in this country. And one time he left, and he, without letting me know, he was taking my son. And he stayed there the whole weekend without calling me, without letting me know how I was doing. I was just going, I didn't know what to do. I was afraid to call the police because I thought he was going to do something to my son. And then when he came back really happy and saying, this is what can happen if you try to do anything to me, or if you try to call the police on me. I just can take the kids away from you.
So by your son disappearing for even a few days, he taught you a lesson.
Yes. And I was like, I was so afraid, and I was just totally, at that time, I just did whatever he wanted me to do. I would just stay home the whole day and clean, not only for him, but for his family too. I just wanted him to be happy, and I wanted his family to be happy with me. So, because I didn't want to cause any trouble in the house, because they, like anybody, him or his brother or his mom, they just could take my kids away from me while I was taking a shower or whatever. And another thing, because my son was old enough, he used to mom talk to any man or male today, like when she went to the store. And if
Pulling your kids into his delusions.
And if my son said, oh yes, she was talking when she went to a guy, the cashier, oh, he will go crazy. So he started using my kids, and I didn't blame my kids. He started using my son as a form to punish me. He knew it's true, but he would just use it to do whatever he wanted, to go back and use drugs or just to leave for a couple of days. And just the threats of taking my kids away.
It's interesting how there's something inside all of us, that says that it's good for children to have two parents, and, it'd be good for a male child to have a male role model. And so we buy into some of that manipulation, I think, of abusers. I was watching a presentation by Dr. Bruce Perry the other day on brain development, and he said the research is very clear now that a child witnessing domestic violence is actually more impacted and more traumatized and more damaged than a child who's actually physically abused. Just the watching your mother be abused by someone else causes more impact on brain development than physical abuse does on a child. So this whole notion that somehow, he can still be a great dad even though he's been abusive with his partner, and somehow he really needs to, be involved in his child's life when he's violent and abusive is actually not true. There's just no research that really confirms that piece. So it's an interesting dynamic. We still buy into it. Yeah, but we want him to have a father, we needed the father to be involved in his life. That's true, as long as he's not violent and abusive and manipulative and using the children in order to abuse you yet further in the process. Let's keep moving here. I know our time is getting short for the presentation, and then we'll be going to some of the questions we've received, and we've received many. Let's talk just a little bit about male privilege. One of the things on Ellen Pence's power and control wheel is this whole dynamic of male privilege, whether it's in the category of machismo or it's in this notion of the kind of empowered male and male power in general. That comes from a cultural dynamic or a physical dynamic or a relational dynamic. The reality is that some of the things listed on the screen where the man puts himself here and the woman puts himself here is part of the abuse cycle. And I know if Kevin had been able to join us, he would talk about, he didn't have male privilege in his relationship. Male partner was the abuser, and she basically put herself in a position of power with him. But in most of the classic cases that we see where the power control wheel fits, we see this male privilege piece. Did you experience male privilege, any of you? Did he play that card of, did that happen?
I mean, this is Nicole, but I just knew my role. I remember during an explosion, he pounded on his chest and he said, "I'm a man and you're going to know your role." So and he didn't even need to say it. It was like I just knew that I was inferior to him. And he was going to act out on his privilege as a man.
Anybody else? Did you experience some of that, whether verbally or non-verbally?
This is Jen. I definitely think that's probably one of the things, like was it Ellen, that she talked about, that she said they feel entitled to it. I think that they, because they're the man, they feel like they can call every shot, everything, that has to do everything that they say, and every decision that can be made is their decision to make and not ours. But that kind of like goes back, I think, into like the emotional abuse and the minimizing and denying. I think those kind of all tie in together.
It weaves in lots. Well, I do think this is it's an important piece as the domestic violence movement is evolving, and we're seeing violence in same-sex relationships. We're seeing violence from women against men. This is not always necessarily playing itself out, but I think it's important to call it out in a culture where men have been predominantly in control of just about everything in the culture for thousands of years. It should be no great surprise that that does play itself out in a lot of abusive situations. Let's talk for a few minutes about economic abuse. The next kind of piece of the wheel talks about economic abuse and how an abusive partner might focus on getting somebody fired from a job, keeping somebody from getting a job, keeping somebody from going to school, or not wanting somebody to advance their education, whether it has to do with the control of money and control of credit and everything else. Did any of you experience some economic abuse or the leveraging of things around economics or education during your relationship?
I did. The whole relationship. Since I started the relationship, like he took the male privilege. First, but we're Mexican, so he's Mexico really macho man. So women have to stay in the house, take care of their husband, take care of their kids. They don't need to go to school, they have to go to work. And that's what happened. I wanted to get my high school diploma because I didn't finish it, my high school. And I was pregnant, and he would go to the school and ask people, oh, did you saw her with another guy when she was talking to other people? And I was so embarrassed, so embarrassing that people would just come like, is something wrong with him? Is he your husband? Is he your boyfriend? Like, what's going on? So I just decided to leave school because I didn't want to put up with that. Mm-hmm. So that was the end of it. I didn't work at all because he didn't let me work. I never went back to school, and he was the one who brought the money to the house, so he had total control over the money. And if I needed something, I had to ask him for money. It was just I didn't have money at all.
It's a pretty common tactic for him with you.
Yes. So he basically had control over our economic status.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Anybody else on the economic piece?
This is Yvonne. We owned a condo together, and towards the end, when I knew that it was not really working out, he was pressuring me and was to keep both properties. And the thought to me would be that I would be tied really hard economically. After I left him and I was being stalked by him for several months, he would often go to my boss, which he had previously been friends with, and tell him all sorts of things. That my boss looked down at me, and things that weren't actually true. I think in an attempt to, for me to lose my job.
Anybody else in this whole area of economic abuse?
My situation was a little different, where I held a full-time job, and he would take all the money. I mean, it wasn't that he would take it, but I had to give it to him. I just knew that I had to give him my paycheck. And I was also going to school at the same time. So he would drop me off at school and pick me up, and the same with work. So it was like he would just take the money from me. And he wasn't working at the time, so I was really the bread.
So it wasn't a spoken thing, but you just knew you were supposed to turn over all the money to him and he would manage it.
I did. Well, we weren't living together at the time, and he had his own apartment. He didn't have a job, so I would pay his rent. And at the time, I was fine with paying his rent because I didn't want to live with him at the time, and I didn't want to go into that. So I would basically fund his life.
Interesting, different version of economic abuse and manipulation. Those are helpful, and I appreciate you kind of pointing some of those out. Our time is running short here before we go to Q&A, but I do want to touch on these other topics real quick. Coercion and threats. The coercion and threats are far past, the oh baby, I'm never going to do it again. Suddenly it becomes very real and very lethal and potentially very dangerous, and the threats are not implicit, they're just right up there. Did you all experience threats at times? Were there certain things that triggered overt threats versus implicit threats? But did you experience that kind of coercion and those kind of threats in your relationship, and when?
This is Jen. I think you're going to have a hard time finding an abusive relationship that doesn't include coercion and threats. I mean, they start in the relationship and they don't stop after it's over. Every time I do these speaking events, I always tell people that ending the relationship, that's only half the battle. The other half is after, because he stalked me for months, and I would get threats, I would get notes, I would get emails, I would get voicemails. I made the mistake of not changing my phone right away. But, you know, he used to love to tell me that he was going to go away for a long time. And just when I thought that I forgot about him, or he forgot about me, he was going to come back. And he was going to make me sorry that I ever left him. And that worked. That got very scary. I never got a lot of threats in the relationship. They mostly came like a hurricane afterwards.
Anybody else?
This is Yvonne. The threats started early when they were very lethal, and it was pretty much to let me know how strong and powerful he was. They included threats of not only killing me, but how he would dispose of my body in multiple different ways. And the other threat was also when he would get depressed, threatened to kill himself. And so these were very real, and they continued throughout the whole relationship.
Did any of you face a strangulation assault? Did any of you get choked by your partner?
I wouldn't say strangulation, but he did force me to watch him do crystal meth, and he forced me to physically
held you there.
Yes, in bed. He pushed me and then he just got on top of me and just made me stay there, and he actually blew to my face the crystal meth smoke. Just he wanted me to feel what he felt, so I to understand how he felt when he was under the effects of crystal meth.
Wow.
And he also proposed to me a lot of times to sell drugs with him, to have money, to have to move to our own place, and to have more, to buy the kids more stuff. And it was just crazy to me to even think about it. And just for him, like, you wouldn't have someone you love do those kind of things. And also, he always threatened me that he was going to hurt my family, my parents, and my sisters.
If you left or if you didn't do what he wanted?
Yes.
Well, I think that's probably a fair oversight, fair overview of this. And Jen, thank you for that, your statement, which is, I don't think there is an abusive relationship, but there's not some version of this. He either threatens to commit suicide, he threatens to kill you, or to kill others, or he kills our threats and coercion, and all of which let you know this is the way it is, and this is the way it's going to be if you don't do what he wants you to do. Before we get to the end here, I'm just going to touch on a couple other things, and then we're going to jump into questions here in just a moment. Most of you know that, when we do this work all over the country, we hear a lot of myths repeated over and over and over again. We hear a lot of intervention professionals saying, well, what about this and what about this? And probably the most common is probably, why doesn't she leave? Why didn't she leave? Why is she staying? Why doesn't it protect your kids? That piece. I think that there's a lot of sense that as soon as you leave, it's over. And Jen, I think you've touched on that because the reality is that in all the research, everything you're saying is true, which is the majority of abusive behavior in an abusive relationship actually happens after separation in the relationship. Most women in this country that are killed in domestic violence homicides are killed after they leave the relationship or in the process of trying to leave the relationship. So kind of this notion that it's all going to be over once you get out is the exact opposite of reality, which is why when you try to leave, you say, maybe I should go back because it wasn't as bad when I was with him as it is now that I'm trying to get away from him. And I don't know if we were just going to pick one there, that notion of, why isn't it easy to leave? I don't know, can you just give me one for you why it wasn't severe physical abuse, severe emotional abuse, the realization that this is not a good situation that I'm in here, and yet probably everybody stays longer than they should in that situation. Why?
Well, for me, my ex-boyfriend was on crystal meth, and it all started when the drug started, so I was convinced it was like I thought drugs did that to people. I was so naive of the topic of domestic violence. I remember telling Dr. Lass that if anyone's ever done a drug, I will never date them, because I thought that was someone too.
That was all they just weren't using drugs.
As if drugs made you become abusive, and that was so naive, and it's completely wrong. I mean, you either hate women or you don't. That to you. So that was a thing. I was like convinced if he stopped, then everything would go back to normal. That was my theory.
Okay.
My wrong
Anybody
theory.
else? Yvonne?
I knew I had to leave, but he had his daughter living with us, who at the time was 13 years old, and within a 6-month period, she had just lost her mother. So I didn't want to leave her with the monster, and so I was trying to figure my way out. But then when he beat me up severely, it was his daughter who said, "Dad, stop." And after that happened, I felt the responsibility to leave, and I told her, the reason I'm leaving is this physical abuse, and it's not okay.
Nicole?
I often struggled with why didn't I just leave? It was a question I always asked myself, and I like to think of it as a frog in boiling water, because if you put a frog in boiling water, it's just going to out. So if you put the temperature low enough, and then it slowly creeps up, and it's warm, and it's starting to feel better, and it starts boiling, and the lid's already there, and it's too late. And then when you bring in the power and control wheel, it's just so complex, and there are so many factors that keep someone there. And we're experts on our abusers. We know when it's safe and when it's not safe.
Well, let's keep moving here. I know we're running short on time. You've touched on it, I think, Nicole, that moving on is a process. And I do want to just spend a minute before we jump into questions on this issue of moving on. In your journeys, what helped you the most? Was it something that somebody said? Was it how you were treated by somebody? Was it the way an agency helped you? What helped you move on once you started going down this road of, I got to get out of this, I got my life needs, I deserve better than this, I got to go some other direction with my life? What helped worked? What small things made a difference? What big things made a difference?
I didn't really share the relationship with very many people, so I don't want to say like any one person kind of helped me out, because I kept it, kind of a secret. One of my best friends really kind of hit it spot on when I had her come help me move, because I said, I think I need to get out of here. I should move out. And she came over, and I hadn't seen her in weeks, and I was covered in bruises. And she looked at my arms, and her jaw just dropped, and she was like, okay, let's pack up. And when we started eating, she's like, so don't you think you should end this abusive relationship? And I was like, abusive relationship? I'm in an abusive relationship? No, I'm not. And she's like, look at yours. And it was probably the first time I realized she was probably right. One little thing, it sounds like just one question, one remark, but it really made me see that, maybe I was in an abusive relationship. And coming here, obviously, I probably would have kept going back had I not come to the Family Justice Center.
Anybody else? One thing that made a difference, one thing that helped?
This Yvonne, initially I had a good friend, and I was able to bounce things that happened off her, and to show how far I was in the abuse, I had to use her as a gauge. Was this bad? Is this bad? And so I almost lost my own knowledge of what was really bad and what was somewhat okay.
Anybody else?
In my case, I met a lady that was in an abusive relationship for about 20 years, and she moved on, but her daughter was in juvenile hall. She was in jail because she was having the same attitude as her father. And she talked to me and said, your kids are little right now. You can make a difference. You can make them your own way. It's like, if you stay in the relationship, they're going to end up like my daughter. And you're going to end up struggling like me right now. He's never going to change. They never change. So if you don't take a decision right now, then you're going to regret it. And she just shared her story with me and just think how much she was suffering even after the relationship ended. So that's what I was like. Supposedly my reason to stay with him was my kids, but I'm also putting them in danger and putting them in a situation where they're going to be emotionally abused too. So that was the end of the relationship.
That's good. Nicole?
My navigation through the justice system wasn't that great. I think what would have helped the most back then is if I had an advocate who provided me with a lot of resources to really explain how this process is going to go, and to just keep me informed with my case and what I could do.
And you didn't have that.
No, I didn't.
Kind of going through a system that wasn't terribly supportive.
Yeah, and I didn't know what I was doing, and so that would have been the most helpful.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. You've talked a little bit about this issue of what helped, people, programs, friendly faces, kindness. One of the things we found in our first Family Justice Center evaluation was a kind face and an unjudgmental, a non-judgmental person that was welcoming and supportive made a huge difference. Would you all agree with that?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm going to jump into the questions because we have so many questions and not a lot of time left. I'll try to organize these questions a little bit. There's a set of questions around this kind of theme. Was there anything that could have been said during the time that you were minimizing or denying that would have been effective? And at the points where you didn't want to admit it or you didn't want to acknowledge it or you didn't want to stick with the truth about what was really happening objectively, was there anything that could have been said or anything that people could have done that they didn't do? I mean, Jen, you touched on a little, so cared about you, loved you, accepted you, didn't say, you know, what's the matter with you for staying here in this. But anything that could have been said or done that would have helped in that journey of kind of trying to accept the truth about the situation?
This is Yvonne. I think general awareness of that domestic violence, how common it was, I just didn't so often. So if somebody may have shared about domestic violence dynamics early on, it would have really helped.
Yeah, I think Yvonne that's pretty a good point, because I feel like before you are in a domestic violence relationship, you probably don't know that much about it. So you don't know that you're probably being abused. I didn't realize I was going through half these things until I saw this power and control reel, and I realized that I fit into every single one of them. Because before this, I didn't even think I was in an abusive relationship. That's how much lack of knowledge and naive you are about the topic. So I feel like if you don't understand what you're going through, you can't really accept it. Or makes it harder to, at least.
Yeah, I mean, exactly what Jen said. I didn't even know what was going on until I came into the Family Justice Center and saw the power and control wheel. I had no idea what it was. And I think what also was very helpful is when you use the Jacqueline Campbell danger assessment, and you get that number, and it was like, wow, I really am in extreme danger. I need a high-risk team to work with me.
Once you saw that score, that was kind of an objective, oh my gosh, I really am in severe danger.
Yeah, so those two things really helped in realizing what was going
on. This is a sensitive question that's come up a number of times, and you don't have to answer it if you don't want to, or you can answer it in a very generic way if you want to. What people have asked about is whether in the abusive situation, whether sex was used as a weapon or forced sexual activity was commonplace, and how that connected to what you were going through. I don't know if anybody's willing to talk about that, but it's something that I will say that in our world, one of the things we found is that domestic violence people don't often talk about forced sex because, we're looking for whether it fits into a sexual assault response team protocol for a rape case. And if you didn't get a rape exam and if you didn't get examination in 24 hours, and then 6 months later you realize I was forced to do a lot of things sexually that I didn't want to do. And now it's difficult to deal with that or, hold somebody accountable for what was probably serial sexual assaults over the course of the relationship. But it is a topic that comes up sometimes during questions. I don't know if anybody's game to talk about it.
I think it's funny is because I've spoken, I don't even know how many times, and no one's ever asked. And that's not really something that's ever been on anybody's slide. I was forced in sexual situations, and I don't think I've ever talked about it until today. And it's just more, to me, it was just like adding it on the pile because there was so much emotional abuse and then physical abuse and then sexual abuse, and it was just like you had a breaking point. just like icing on the cake after all of these things, like this is happening too.
Mm.
So it's hard to deal with. That's like emotional abuse that stays with you. It's not something that'll leave a mark on you, but it stays with you.
Anybody else?
I didn't know that there was rape through coercion. I mean, I didn't recognize that it was rape because it wasn't forceful, and I knew this person, and again, I wasn't educated on the topic, but there's a lot of rape through coercion. It's not just forceful, hold you down, and I didn't even recognize that until I was at my first Family Justice Center conference, and I went to a workshop at it. There's so much more than I thought it does, but I believe that, a lot of rape through coercion.
We did a study a number of years ago with Children's Hospital in San Diego where children were coming in where there was suspected abuse of a child, and one of the questions we screened for with coming in was, have you ever been forced to do anything sexually that you didn't want to do, whether by emotional coercion or by physical coercion? And it was well over 70% of our adult care providers said it wasn't necessarily physical force, but yeah, I did a bunch of stuff that I didn't want to do sexually because I knew I better, because I was going to I didn't submit to it. And that was a real eye-opener for me. That was almost 15 years ago. And as we're doing more and more work around trauma-informed care, it's a significant topic. It's one of those very intimate, personal things that causes a lot of trauma that you can't see. So I appreciate you kind of sharing that and reflecting on that a little bit. Some of the questions that have come up additionally are from law enforcement professionals and others, and I'm going to take a couple of these because they've asked me to respond to a number of these, but I'd dive this. There was a question about who was the presenter that I referenced regarding the effect of witnessing domestic violence on children. I referenced, though there's a number of folks who are doing some amazing work. Dr. Lynn Chamberlain, who's a child psychologist in Alaska, is going to be the keynote speaker at our conference this next April. Linda's done amazing work. A friend of mine, Dr. Vince Felitti, is the co-author of the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, which is probably one of the leading studies in America around childhood experiences on men and women who have grown up in abusive situations or faced trauma and abuse as children. But my reference was to Dr. Bruce Perry, who's really internationally renowned and does live brain scans of children who have experienced abuse, witnessed domestic violence, and you can actually see how their brain does not develop at the same rate as a child who has not been abused or who has not witnessed abuse. So that was the question there. Then there's a whole series of questions about law enforcement and the use of the power and control wheel with law enforcement. One listener says, for law enforcement officers, can Casey please address how the police response to the victim can negatively impact the victim? Like when in a situation where the police shift the burden to the victim. Why do you stay? Why did you break his stuff? Why did you fight back? Why did you call him names? I will just comment on that, and then I'd love you all to comment on that, because I do think that's one that's very relevant to all of us. I've been training law enforcement for 25 years, and I am amazed at how often law enforcement asks things somewhat out of ignorance. But they see something happen, why did you throw that at him during a fight? And it's hard for a law enforcement officer to explain, why did you swing back at him? If you were being abused, why did you fight back? And I'll just give you my perspective, and that is, I think we fail to understand that we're human beings. And human beings, when they're assaulted, our natural reaction is to defend ourselves. And legally, just so you all know, that's okay. The problem we have is how to sort that out. But people that are severely being abused and violated only have a couple of choices. They can become passive, they can try to get away, or they can fight back. And all of those reactions exist in domestic violence situations, just like they exist in every other situation. And if I was attacked on the street, I would not just roll up in a ball and say, you know what, go ahead and just beat me up. I would fight back. I would try to defend myself. And if somebody was trying to put their hands around my neck or sexually assaulting me, I would fight back. And then officers would arrive and say, wow, this mutual combat, look, he fought back. How stupid does that sound when I just describe it as me? And yet in a domestic violence situation, I see law enforcement jump to that all the time. I don't know if you have any reactions to that, or kind of if any of you had a bad experience with law enforcement, or a good experience on the other side where somebody didn't act that way or ask you stupid questions or ask you questions that felt like they were blaming you for what had happened. Anybody?
In my case, it was actually a really positive experience. The officer came to my parents' house and he took the evidence, his text messages, and heard the voicemails, and he said, "You're in danger. You need to go to an emergency shelter, get a doctor, and just put yourself in a safe place with your kids."
So he was very affirming what happened to you.
Yes, and then he referred me to the Family Justice Center, and I went the next morning, and there was actually already, the detective was there. Like, it was like he was waiting for me, and then this volunteer at that time from the Family Justice Center, like you said, it was this amazing old lady. She just listened to me, understood me, and it was just the whole day with me, and that really made me feel safe and comfortable.
Yvonne?
One of the police officers who interviewed my abuser, he was very supportive, encouraged me to get a restraining order, even though I had previously attempted to get a restraining order and then pulled out. He really encouraged me and just saying, please help us so we can help you. But just a sincere person being there to help made all the difference.
That's good. There's a number of questions around your perspective, and quite a number of people would like your perspective. Looking back now, kind of out of situation, and very healthy relationships now, looking back on this dynamic of, do you think abusers can change? Do you think batterers can change? In your experience, do you think that somehow there's significant or simple or easy things that cause them to change the way they're doing, or do you think that this is something that's, once it's in them deep, I mean, what are your perspectives about the ability of abusers to change?
I mean, I've always believed that people can change. People, you know, I just feel like people who have used to be alcoholics or people that used to do drugs. I mean, I've always felt like people can change. I wouldn't stick around to find out. I wouldn't date someone who said that that happened to them in the past. I wouldn't be there like the test rod. I wouldn't be the guinea pig. You know, I would hope that, you know, someone like that can change. But, I mean, it's like a needle in a haystack. No.
Others?
I believe that there are like two different kinds of abusers. There's a old temper tantrum, and then there's the domestic terrorist. And a lot of us have had experience with domestic terrorists. I do believe, I'm a little more skeptical on complete change. I think the 52-week batter program is a great program, but I don't think 52 weeks is enough. I think they're just starting to uncross their arms and maybe open up at that time. I think there's hope, but I think there needs to be a little bit more work on the batterer side as well.
Or then you don't have the test case for the
I will not stick around to find
second
out.
partner of an abuse victim?
Right.
This Yvonne, in my case, he had previously abused people, and then he went to jail for about 1.5 years, completed all the batterer programs and that type of thing. And since then, I've identified at least one person who has filed a restraining order saying, quote, that he told her he would shoot her with a rifle from a long distance. So I don't believe most of them can change.
Wow. Lisbeth?
I agree with Jan and Yvonne and Karina. I'm a religious person, and I do believe people can change, but that's only if they want to. And most of them, they don't want to. It's like they were already born that way. And in my case with my abuser, it's been 3 years, and I have known that he's been abusive to other women too. So that kind of puts me in the line where if I should believe that people can change or if they're not. So I'm just like in that line still. I don't know what to believe.
No, and I think your experience is valuable to everybody listening to this. There's a few other questions that we're not going to have the time to get to as we wrap up the webinar in any detail. At least we're not going to get to them. There's a number of questions from law enforcement about how to use the power and control wheel without implanting false memories or without helping a client exactly on kind of being accused then of planting ideas in their heads. But I will say, as I mentioned earlier, that our recommendation is the power and control wheel should be used, particularly by investigators on follow-up investigation. and that it's best used without all of the listings, excuse me, without all the listings underneath the title. So instead of it being, let's say, for example, using coercion and threats, making and carrying out threats to do something, threatening to leave her, we take out all the bottom parts of that, and we would just use the title, using coercion and threats, or using intimidation. And then I don't think there's anything inappropriate or leading about an investigator saying, you know, in my experience as an investigator dealing with domestic violence cases, it's not uncommon for a perpetrator of abuse to use intimidation. Did your partner ever intimidate you? That's not inappropriate for a law enforcement officer to do that. It's like when Gail trains on assault, she will often tell a law enforcement officer that it's okay to say, you know, when somebody's been choked by their partner, sometimes they might wet their pants, or they might have a mess in their pants. It's okay to say that because it gives them permission to say, yeah, I did pee in my pants, and she just told us something that we need to know, because that means she almost died if she urinated while she was being strangled. She was almost dead. And we need to know that, and she might not otherwise tell us because she's embarrassed to tell us. So I think that it is an important tool, and I think it can be used appropriately. And then there's a whole series of questions about this fighting back and self-defense thing, and I just want to comment for our listeners. We believe that far more training still needs to be done, and it needs to be consistently done and done again on what the predominant aggressor is, what the difference is between a predominant aggressor and an initial aggressor. I remember prosecuting a case many years ago where the victim threw a glass pitcher at her partner and hit him in the head, and then she ran after she threw it at him, and he tackled her over abusively. And his response out there was self-defense. I was defending myself. Now, mind you, he had stopped after she'd thrown the pitcher. I think it would have been, in the criminal justice system, she should have been held accountable for throwing the pitcher. But 3 months later on the witness stand, you know what she said? She said, I threw the pitcher to get it over with because I knew he was going to hit me, and I just wanted to get it over with because after we got it over with, we'd be able to make up again. So I threw the pitcher, and I ran because I realized now he's going to beat me up. And lo and behold, he did badly beat her. And we had to explain it to a jury. We had to put a battered woman's syndrome expert on the witness stand and say, he doesn't get to do that. That's not self-defense. He was chasing her through the house and tackling her. So I want to come back just briefly. Did you all fight back in an incident? Did any of you try to fight? And if you did try to fight back, did it make the violence worse? Was it an instinct because the violence was so severe? I don't know if anybody wants to comment on that. Yvonne?
I did not have a chance to fight back, so I don't really...
Because of his power and his abilities, or what?
It happened so quick, and I really didn't, you know, and next thing I knew I was on the floor.
It would just explode.
Yeah.
I talked earlier about it. I fought back. I don't know, I must have thought I was Superwoman at the time because I tried everything that I could. And then that was part of the reason afterwards, too, that I blamed myself. Because I had, like, hit him back, and I was just trying to, you know, get him out of my face and get him off of me, that I would kick and scream and hit, and I would do everything that I could to try to do it. Like I said, if you think you're going down, I mean, something just comes out of you where you're like, your instinct is to fight. Mine was to fight back. That was my instinct.
Well, and I think very significantly, if a good law enforcement officer had used the power and control with you, it wouldn't have been he said, she said, mutual combat. It would have been put this violence in the context of what's really going on in this relationship, and they would have seen your partner up and you down, and the violence being used to control you and you trying to defend yourself. And I've got to tell you, I long for the day in America where every law enforcement officer and every prosecutor thinks like that and examines it like that, because a lot more violent abusers, and they'd be arresting a lot fewer victims of domestic violence who end up going today. They fight back, and then suddenly they're the perpetrator, or it's a mutual combat situation. I think mutual combat in most cases kind of stupid phrase, because when somebody's defending themselves, that's not mutual combat. And mutual combat is a bit of a fair fight, and in most domestic violence situations, in my career as a prosecutor, I haven't seen too many fair fights that are going on physically. As we wrap up here, I don't know, I'd love each of you to just share a comment, if you want to, a comment about what you think law enforcement intervention professionals should know, maybe a comment about, for a survivor to this today, who's trying to make the decision about what to do. Any closing comment from any of you? We can start anywhere.
The only thing I would say, I guess, to like policemen or people in a situation that haven't been in it themselves, just be patient. I know it sounds so easy to walk away, and it sounds really, really easy to just pretend, you know, that the relationship didn't happen, and breakups are hard, but, you know, just leave. It's really not that simple. There's so much that goes into it, and unless you have done it yourself, you are never going to understand how they feel.
Good, Jen.
Yvonne, I think that for a lot of people, law enforcement's usually first that's interfacing with the survivor, and it's just really important for them to be kind, supportive, and non-judgmental.
Good, Yvonne.
I believe that for law enforcement and advocates and prosecutors, it's really bring it back in and what does the client need, and because they're an expert on their lives, and just trying to figure out maybe what avenue they want to take, because sometimes they just can't leave right then and there. So trying to figure that out and become a resource. Yeah, be a resource.
Good, Nicole. Elizabeth?
For the law enforcement, most of the victims, they don't know what domestic abuse really is. Like, they know it's wrong that their abuser is hitting them or any physical abuse, but they don't know about all the emotional abuse. So if law enforcement can just take 5 minutes to give them information and just educate them a little bit more about domestic abuse, that can make a difference, because most of the victims, they're not educated at all about what is domestic abuse. And I think 5 minutes will make a big difference.
Well, and I think that's an important area of DV dynamics and DV 101 is, in my experience, a lot of victims don't view themselves as victims at all. Even if the relationship's gone on for a long time, they still don't think they're battered women or that they're really being victimized. It's a relationship that has problems. Did any of you have a tough time? I mean, this is the category of this whole topic. Did you all have a tough time admitting that you were actual abuse victims at some point?
Even until this moment, my relatives and friends, they're like, do you really went through this? Because he would look like an amazing guy. He was always a good person, helping others. Like, what did he do to you for you to get to this point? And now
did that make it harder for you to admit what was happening to you when they didn't believe it or they didn't validate you?
Well, for one side would tell me, like, they don't know everything. They don't know what I went through. But in the other side, I would say, like, he had a good part of him. So it kind of make me, like, feel like sometimes guilty. But at this point, I don't feel guilty at all. But
now that you're out of it.
Yes.
Yeah. Any other reactions?
This Yvonne, I think it took me years to even admit to other people that I'd been through a domestic violence situation. So there's a lot of shame that goes along with it.
You know, you said earlier, if there's any victims listening, if anyone was thinking about leaving, the only thing I would have to say is that this is not your story. This is not your story. This is not why you were put in this world, to deserve something like this, regardless of what you have done in your life. You may have done awful things, you may have done things you're doing, or what you've done. Nobody deserves this.
Well, I think, Jen, that's a good place to wrap up our panel. Is you don't deserve this. I remember many years ago, and I just blogged on it on our website, Sarah Buell saying to me, Casey, if you never do anything else as a prosecutor in your whole career when you communicate with survivors, say these 5 things. Say, I'm afraid for you. I'm afraid for your safety. I'm afraid for the safety of your children. You don't deserve to be treated like this available. And then she said, the last thing, to always plant the seed. I'll always be here for you when you need me. Even if it's not right now, you don't want to talk to me now, I will always be here for you when you need me. And those are certainly messages that we can all deliver, whether we're a police officer, a prosecutor, or an advocate, or a mental health professional, as we're working with survivors. And as we're focusing on the reality that the vast majority of what you've all just described wasn't actually based on your choices. It was based on the choices of another human being that you were in a relationship with, who chose to make really bad, unhealthy choices about how to treat another person that he said cared about. So we appreciate you all being with us today. As we wrap up, I do just want to, again, in April, our Voices Committee will be part of our conference this next April in San Diego. We will, as I mentioned, have Dr. Linda Chamberlain as our keynote speaker. The theme of our conference this next April is entitled The Root of All Crime, and we're really going to be looking at these core fundamental issues, which is, and I would guess it's true in every one of your situations, that perpetrating violence and abuse came out of a home with some mix of domestic violence and child abuse and or drugs and alcohol. Very few abusers come out of healthy, functional, happy homes. They learned it as a child, their brain developed in a certain pattern as a child, and they went on to repeat that cycle as teens and as adults. And we'll be focusing on that in the intersection between child abuse and domestic violence and sexual assault and elder abuse and human trafficking at our conference in San Diego this next April. I will mention a website at FamilyJusticeCenter.com that are available in our store. The Gael Strack and I have written about the Family Justice Center movement and about the challenge that agencies have to work in a multidisciplinary way to really meet the needs of victims, because all that you described create a lot of need for people to work together to help you. Would you all agree with that? You get a lot of complex needs, and you need a lot of people working together to help you and help your kids. So those books are available on our website. I want to thank each of our panelists for joining us today. Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Yvonne. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Elizabeth, for telling your story. My dad always used to say, a person's experience is never at the mercy of a person with an argument. And we could argue all day long, but when you share your experience, it's power and it's inspiration to others, and you've shared your experiences today. So blessings on each of you. Thank you for caring enough and taking the time out of work to come and do this with us today. And God bless you all for the work you do in this field as we continue to dream of a day when violence fades away, is broken, and we can support relationships where the violence never starts, and kids can grow up without violence and abuse, and women can go to sleep at night not afraid of what's going to happen to them in their own home or at the hands of another. Blessings on all of you. Thanks for joining us today.